In the dust-choked plains of Montana, where the clang of metal mixed with the familiar calls of auctioneers, where lives were measured by the numbers scribbled on small white tags, a silent figure stepped into the metal cage at the heart of the auction ring. But it didn't move with the pride of a strong, healthy animal. It dragged itself in, thin, filthy, trembling, a German shepherd. No name was called. No applause followed. Just a break in the noise, a crack in the current of the live market. Its right hind leg dragged across the hard-packed dirt, each step scraping like a blade against gravel. The dog's once sleek black and gray coat was now clumped and sticky with mud and dried blood. A faded scar still circled its neck, left by a chain that hadn't been meant to protect, but to dominate. No one knew its name. Perhaps it once had one, but now it was simply Lot 47. It didn't howl, it didn't cry, it didn't try to be noticed. It just stood there, a forgotten creature, its eyes a mix of surrender and quiet expectation, as if it had grown used to being looked at like a broken thing. Not worth keeping, someone muttered. Probably bit someone, another whispered. The auctioneer moved on quickly, eyes darting nervously when no hands rose. A few scoffs, a few bored shrugs. Around here, only dogs that were strong, alert, and barked on cue were worth bidding on. This one, labeled a walking burden, was just dead weight taking up space. Then, just as the gavel began to fall like a sentence, a sound stirred from the back row, the soft rustle of worn fabric as a hand was raised. No one recognized the man. They saw only a faded leather coat, dust-covered boots, and gray-streaked hair falling over a pair of calm, winter-blue eyes. Thomas Miller didn't speak. A slow, steady nod was enough to quiet the room. "Sold," the auctioneer said, dry and confused. The dog, later named Rook, lifted its head, not out of hope, but from instinct. Its eyes, long dulled by fear and suffering, locked onto a gaze that carried no judgment, no demands, no pity. Just the look of a man who had seen enough loss to understand that a creature didn't need to be whole to be worthy of stepping out of the dark. Thomas walked forward in silence. He stopped in front of the dog, resting one hand gently on its shoulder, so lightly the fall breeze could have carried it away. And then, something no one expected happened. Rook leaned in. Quietly, he shifted all his weight onto his remaining legs and pressed against the man's shin, as if, in that blurred, fragile moment, he sensed that this hand, these eyes, this quiet heart hadn't come to claim him, but to find something of their own that had been lost, too. Amid a few quiet sighs and the pale light of a fading day, Thomas Miller led the dog, discarded, forgotten, out of the auction yard. Neither of them looked back, because both knew the only thing worth holding on to was what lay ahead. And as they passed through the rusted gates, their real story had only just begun. The afternoon wind swept across the empty auction yard, lifting a fine layer of dust that clung to faded jackets and slipped into the unhealed wounds along the thin body of the dog. No one noticed him anymore. The crowd had turned away, counting profits in their heads. Only one man remained, Thomas Miller, his gaze not seeking value, but listening for something quiet that stirred within him. The German shepherd, still unnamed, stood in the center of the space like a forgotten question mark. 4 frail legs held up a body that had long since surrendered. His right hind leg dragged across the ground, not out of defiance or retreat, but with the stillness of something that had given up long ago. His coat, once surely smooth and shining, was now stained with dry mud, old scars, and dark streaks of blood faded like rust. Thomas didn't approach like someone who'd just made a purchase. He didn't offer pity or urgency. Instead, he crouched down, keeping a respectful distance, and slowly extended a hand. Palm open, calm and steady, like setting down a breath in the middle of a storm. He didn't speak, didn't coax. It was simply a patient hand, offered by someone who knew that sometimes the lightest touch was louder than any words. Rook, who would soon have that name, didn't move forward, didn't turn to leave. He only tensed slightly, his body wound like a bowstring that hadn't released an arrow in years. His eyes flicked briefly to the man's face, searching, as if trying to decide whether this gesture was genuine or just another familiar trap, like the ones he'd fallen into too many times before. The silence between them stretched, not frightening, but heavy with history. The wind whistled through the planks and slipped beneath Thomas's worn leather coat. It brushed against the deep scar circling Rook's neck, a mark that even time couldn't erase. Still, the hand didn't withdraw. It remained steady, open, feather light but unwavering. And then, something shifted. Rook, after a long moment, tilted his head, not out of trust, but in one final effort to see whether there was anyone left in the world gentle enough not to reopen old wounds. The movement was slow, barely conscious, but then his whole body seemed to exhale. He leaned forward and rested gently against Thomas's knee, like a withered branch finding the last patch of earth still soft enough to take root. He didn't bark, didn't shake. He simply let out a breath, so faint it could have been mistaken for wind slipping through the cracked stone. Thomas didn't speak, didn't pull his hand back. He left it resting on the dog's shoulder, not to soothe, not to comfort, just to be there. A quiet presence saying, "I see you, and I will not hurt you." Rook didn't know why he did it, whether it was exhaustion, unexpected warmth, or because he had nothing left to lose, but his head leaned into that hand, and that simple contact, however fragile, marked the first time he had willingly reached out to a human since the days he'd been chained, beaten, and discarded like a tool too broken to fix. They didn't move right away. They stayed in the dust and quiet, unnoticed by the world, but bound by a single moment where two lives brushed against each other. To the outside, it might have seemed like nothing more than an old man picking up a crippled dog. But to Thomas and Rook, it was the first time they had truly seen each other, as two souls that knew too well the weight of darkness. Thomas slowly wrapped one arm under the dog's belly, lifting him, not like lifting cargo, but like retrieving something precious that had been missing far too long. And strangely, Rook didn't resist. He trembled slightly, then rested quietly in the man's arms, as if his body too was surprised by the sudden peace. When Thomas left the auction yard, his steps left no deep marks on the ground. But inside Rook, a trace had been made, a quiet impression of something unnamed, something that told his body it was okay to stop guarding, okay to breathe, okay to begin, just a little, the long journey of learning to exist beside another human again. And so, with one touch, one breath, and one silence so deep it swallowed time, a promise was made between them. Not spoken, not sealed, but real enough to begin a journey that neither of them could have ever imagined. As Thomas stepped through the rusted iron gate, carrying the dog in his arms as if holding something more fragile and precious than anything ever sold at that auction, the sun had begun to spread across the western hills. The Montana sky shifted slowly, washing golden light over thin clouds and casting a warm orange hue across the dirt-streaked, motionless body nestled against his chest. The road ahead wasn't long, but it led to a place no one else had ever entered, except him. And now, for the first time, another soul was coming along, a nameless, homeless dog who had finally found a hand gentle enough to lean on. The old pickup engine sputtered to life, groaning like it, too, had grown tired of traveling alone. As they headed toward Laurel, the tires rolled steadily over the red dust, leaving behind the noise and indifference of the day. Thomas didn't turn on the radio, didn't talk to himself like he usually did, and didn't look back. He only glanced at the rearview mirror each time the truck jolted over bumps, watching the dog curled up in the back on a thick blanket, eyes half closed, body taut like a string pulled too tight. Each jolt made Rook flinch, not from pain, but from habit. He still couldn't believe that the shaking didn't come with a blow, a yell, or the sharp snap of punishment. Though he had left the cramped auction pen behind, his mind hadn't yet followed. Thomas knew this. That's why he said nothing the entire ride, because sometimes silence is the first language that the wounded can understand. The cabin appeared behind a row of pines, old, modest, and quiet, just like its owner. One side of the roof sagged, the chimney puffed a faint ribbon of smoke into the darkening sky, and the wooden porch, with a few wind-beaten pots of dead plants, was the only sign that someone still lived here. Thomas had stayed in this place for years. No guests, no strangers, and no ties left to the town below. When he opened the truck door, Rook didn't move. He only cracked an eye open, waiting for a command, a shout, or worse, a rough yank. But all that came was the familiar pair of arms lifting him again, careful as if holding a fracture that might shatter with the slightest wrong touch. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, smoke, and years gone by. A quiet warmth that didn't need to prove itself. No television, no music, just the emptiness Thomas had learned to live with. He laid Rook down gently on an old flannel blanket set near the fireplace, tucking a few soft towels on either side to keep the chill out. The fire hadn't been lit. Dry logs still sat in the iron basket near the corner. But Thomas didn't rush. He didn't turn on the lights either. He simply sat next to the dog, not touching, not speaking, just watching. Not like an owner waiting for a reaction, but like a guest who'd just been allowed a glimpse into another soul's private world. Rook didn't sleep. His eyes drooped, but never fully closed. Every small sound, a creak of wood, a gust slipping through the window cracks, the brush of Thomas's sleeve against the table, made his body twitch. His gaze stayed wary, alert, not quite believing this place wasn't just a temporary stop before being discarded again. Eventually, Thomas lit the fire. The warm orange glow danced across the wooden walls and filtered through Rook's dusty fur, casting slow-moving shadows across the floor like time itself was treading carefully around them. Thomas made a simple stew: chicken, potatoes, a few vegetables, and bone broth. The scent wasn't strong, but it was enough to make Rook's ears twitch slightly. Still, when Thomas placed a bowl nearby, Rook didn't eat. He looked, not with hunger, but with the suspicion of one who had been punished for things he never understood. His eyes followed Thomas's every move, from washing his hands to lifting a spoon to simply adjusting the fire. Every time Thomas raised his hand, even to reach for a glass, Rook's body tensed, as if the very shadow of a hand could carry the weight of old wounds he no longer had words for. Thomas didn't push. He didn't call, didn't coax with food. After dinner, he sat down across from Rook on the floor, back against the wooden wall, holding a cooling cup of tea, eyes drifting with the flicker of the fire. When night settled in, he laid another small blanket beside the dog. Not over him, but near enough, so that if Rook chose, it would be there. Much later, once the fire had burned halfway through the logs, Rook began to breathe more steadily. Not sleep, but something deeper, where breath came more evenly, no longer broken by constant vigilance. Thomas still didn't touch him. He only sat close by. When the fire gave a soft crack, Thomas reached out, not to cover Rook, but to place his hand gently near the edge of the blanket, as if to say, without words, "It's here if you need it." There was no dramatic moment, no sparkly eyes or joyful bark, just a fullness in the quiet. A space where a man who had lived too long alone and a dog who had lived too long afraid began to learn how to sit near one another without harming. And in this cabin, where no one had ever been allowed before, a second soul left its first footprint, not on the floorboards, but in the space Thomas had long reserved only for memory. Memories he'd buried deep until Rook arrived, and without saying a word, brought them back just by being there. Night fell like a thick wool curtain, slowly draping itself over the roof of the old cabin nestled in the Laurel Mountains. The firelight flickered faint patterns on the wooden ceiling, shimmering like memories creeping cautiously back after years of silence. Thomas sat still, unmoving, his tired eyes never leaving the gaunt figure curled up not far from him. Rook hadn't slept. His dark eyes remained barely closed, ears twitching at every crackle of the fire, every shift of Thomas's arm against the chair. He didn't eat, didn't sigh, didn't make a sound, only watched, as if every movement the man made might suddenly shift into a blow, a command, or a familiar shout. In his eyes wasn't fear exactly, but a quiet readiness for the next pain, the next punishment, the next betrayal, always arriving on time and without warning. Thomas stayed quiet. He knew silence. He also knew that in the beginning, the most trustworthy language between two beings who had not yet learned to trust was patience. Instead of coaxing or gesturing, he stood, pulled the second blanket from the wooden chair by the window, folded it in half, and gently laid it on the floor, just close enough to Rook's side. Not draped, not forced, just offered. The air inside wasn't cold, but the chill inside the dog had not lifted. Rook didn't look at the blanket, didn't look at Thomas. He only curled a little tighter, as if to hold on to what warmth still lingered in the floorboards after a day's sun. Each time Thomas moved, Rook's body tensed, as if ready to retreat at the slightest sign of pressure. But when he realized Thomas wasn't stepping closer, wasn't commanding, wasn't grabbing, his shoulders eased, not in surrender, but simply because he no longer had the strength to stay guarded. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, dragging the crack of falling pine branches into the night. But inside, between the flickering firelight, there was only the soft creak of old wood and the faint breathing of a dog still learning what safety felt like. Thomas lowered himself to the floor, leaning against the wooden chair, hands resting calmly on his knees, in a posture that posed no threat. He didn't look directly at Rook. Eye contact could still feel like a challenge to a creature used to being cornered. Instead, his gaze followed the firelight's slow dance. Hours passed without a word, but something in the space between them had begun to shift. Rook still hadn't touched the food. The broth had cooled, and the scent faded into the room's quiet. But strangely, he hadn't moved away either. Though his body was tense, his eyes open, and his breath uneven, Rook stayed. And for Thomas, that was already the first sign. When midnight passed and the fire had burned low, the coals cast a soft red glow in the dark. Thomas reached for a smaller blanket, pulled it a little closer, and placed his hand gently on the edge, not moving it further, not pulling it back. He closed his eyes as if prepared to wait there all night if that's what it took. And then, just when it seemed like nothing would change, something fragile happened. Rook shifted, just slightly. So subtle it would be missed if not watched moment by moment. He didn't rise, didn't crawl over, just slid one paw forward, then hesitantly placed his left foot, the one that had been struck so many times, against the soft edge of Thomas's waiting fingers. No words, no gasps, no triumphant music, only the barest touch. Between skin and fur, between surviving and wanting to live, between a broken past and a flicker of present. Thomas didn't move. His hand stayed still, didn't grasp, didn't tighten, as if he understood that for a dog like Rook, even the smallest contact was a leap of faith, a fragile gamble with all that was left of his trust. And the most valuable thing Thomas could offer was simply not to break that moment. Rook left his paw there for a few seconds, then pulled it back, curling in again, his eyes still open, but softer now. His breath seemed to slow. His ears no longer flicked at every sound. Neither of them slept deeply that night. But something had been laid down, without words, without shape, without a name, like the first stone laid at the foundation of a home that had never existed before. Not trust them yet, not safety, but a beginning. And sometimes that's all it takes. A touch, a blanket placed near the fire, and just enough space not to cause more pain, for two fractured souls to begin building something that might one day be called hope. That night, inside the small cabin bathed in the dying glow of ember light, time did not pass with its usual ticking rhythm. It moved quietly, following the uneven breaths of a dog trying to relearn the meaning of peace. Outside, the wind circled the wooden walls. The temperature dropped a few more degrees, and the pines whispered secrets only trees could understand. Thomas remained where he was, eventually leaning his head against the wall and dozing off, half asleep, half awake. When the first light of dawn crept through the frost-covered window pane, casting a soft beam onto the worn wooden floor, Thomas stirred, not from a sound, but from a weight resting gently against his side. He didn't open his eyes right away. Something in his instincts told him that something new had just entered the closed world he had protected for so long. As he slowly turned, eyes still heavy with sleep, the first thing he saw was a dark, furred form curled tightly beside him, breathing steadily. Rook. He wasn't lying on his old blanket, nor had he retreated to the corner of the room as he had the night before. Somehow, during the night, he had moved closer, just enough to press his back against the edge of Thomas's coat, as if warmth had finally overcome suspicion and allowed him to inch nearer to a human being. Thomas said nothing. He didn't make any sudden movements, nor did he reach out to pet him. He simply stayed still, quietly observing the small creature who once trembled at the slightest gesture, now able to relax just enough to fall asleep near him, even if only at the outermost edge of trust. Rook's ears were still slightly drooped, and every small sound, the crackle of wood in the fireplace, the wingbeat of a woodpecker in the forest, made him twitch. But he didn't move away. That alone spoke more than any thank you could, not because he fully trusted Thomas, but because he was beginning to believe. Maybe this time, he wouldn't be betrayed. Thomas carefully sat up, the blanket slipping off his shoulders as morning light spread in a faint halo across the floor. Rook opened his eyes. A glance, not startled, not growling, just the look of someone used to waking in self-defense. But this time, seeing that Thomas didn't approach or reach for him, that gaze softened, and Rook rested his head back on the floor again, as if to say, "I'm still watching, but for now, I don't need to run." Thomas got to his feet and walked to the kitchen. He started brewing coffee, not for routine, but because the warm aroma of fresh grounds seemed to push back the cold memories clinging to the cabin's walls. As the kettle hissed and the scent began to rise, he kept glancing toward Rook, noting every small change, the dog's position, the looseness in his limbs, the rhythm of his blinking. Tiny details to anyone else, but to Thomas, they meant everything. By the fire, Rook no longer lay curled up like the night before. He now rested on his side, front legs tucked in but head stretched out, allowing for deeper breaths and a more open chest. It wasn't true sleep yet, but at least the air moved through his lungs without the stuttering pulse of fear. And for the first time, Thomas noticed Rook wasn't glancing toward the door as if it were his only escape. When Thomas placed a bowl of food beside the blanket, he didn't leave as he had the night before. Instead, he sat nearby, close enough to be present, but not so near as to intrude. Rook looked at the food, then at Thomas. A long pause. He didn't rush in, didn't show hunger, but he also didn't retreat. That alone was another step. Small, fragile, but meaningful. After a few minutes, Rook shifted. He didn't move straight toward the bowl, but slowly crawled closer, belly low, until his head touched the edge of the blanket. And then he stopped, as if he hadn't come for the food, but to see if the distance offered by the man was truly safe. Thomas didn't smile, didn't clap or cheer like someone training a puppy. He simply watched, letting Rook know that his presence came with no expectations, And in that still moment, Thomas realized that Rook wasn't looking for a master. He was trying to figure out if a human could be a friend. As sunlight spilled into the cabin and chased away the cold trapped in the wood, Rook finally closed his eyes. For real this time, not in guarded slits, but with lids that no longer trembled with tension. He didn't sleep deeply nor for long, but it was enough for his small body to stop coiling like a bow with no target. And Thomas, watching him slip into that fragile rest, understood something quietly profound. Last night, it wasn't he who had been allowed into the dog's life, but Rook, with remarkable courage, had decided to step into his. No one could say how long that sleep would last, but in the small cabin, deep in the woods, it was the first sleep of a dog who once couldn't even dream of peace. Morning light stretched through the small wooden window, filtering through the frayed fabric and falling like a soft veil across the floorboards of the cabin. Rook still lay there, near the fireplace, his head resting lightly on the jacket Thomas had left behind the night before. Though his sleep had been brief and fragile, it marked something beginning to shift, quietly, but steadily, between two beings too familiar with the dark. Thomas rose without making a sound. He brewed a cup of coffee, just strong enough to push back the weariness that clung after a night spent in watchful quiet. He didn't call Rook, nor did he try to wake him with footsteps. He simply set down a ceramic bowl next to the dog's spot, soft rice, shredded chicken, a bit of mashed vegetables, and warm bone broth. No spices, no unfamiliar smells. Rook stirred when the bowl touched the floor, not with panic, but with watchfulness. He didn't leap up, didn't fidget. He simply lifted his head, looked at Thomas, then at the bowl, like he was trying to determine whether this was a trap disguised as kindness. A test, just like the ones he'd known before, where the clang of a bowl could be followed by punishment if he reacted the wrong way. Thomas said nothing. He sat on the floor, not too close and not too far, just near enough for Rook to feel his presence without pressure. He took a quiet sip of coffee, eyes on the dog, but his gaze was soft, never sharp, an unspoken whisper, "I'm here, doing nothing, demanding nothing." Rook watched him for a few more breaths, then cautiously moved toward the bowl. He didn't walk like a dog going to eat. He crept, head low, ears back, his whole body dragging the weight of something invisible. When he reached the edge of the bowl, he paused. He didn't eat. He listened. Every small sound inside the cabin, the kettle's faint hiss, the spoon tapping against Thomas's mug, the wind brushing the window frame, was a signal, a possible threat. He lowered his head, sniffed the food, and licked a bit of broth. Then immediately looked up, scanning the room, his body still tight as a drawn string, ready to bolt at the slightest wrong cue. Thomas didn't move. He let it unfold at Rook's pace. Slow, broken, uncertain, but real. The dog began to eat, cautiously, not like a starving stray, but like a soul who'd been punished every time it dared to satisfy its needs. After a few bites, he would pause, lift his head, look at Thomas, then at the door, as if asking, "Is it really okay this time?" Only when Thomas remained still, unchanged, calm, unmoving, did Rook lean back down. The food slowly disappeared, not with normal gulps, but with careful, deliberate licks. Every swallow was another act of faith. That meal didn't last long, nor was it quick. It unfolded like a ritual of trust being tested. And each time Rook dipped his muzzle to eat, he was gambling everything on the hope that this piece might be real. When the last bite was gone, Rook didn't lick the bowl. He didn't wag his tail. He simply stepped back slightly and lay down again, head turned toward Thomas. Not directly facing him, but not turning away either. His body wasn't completely relaxed, but his breath had found a slower rhythm. Thomas placed his empty mug down on the floor and gave a quiet nod, not as a reward, but as an acknowledgement. On that cold morning in the woods, a once broken spirit had just passed a quiet, invisible test. Rook closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but not in fear either. That simple meal was the first time he had accepted a human, not as a threat in his space, but as part of the space itself. And Thomas, the man who made no promises, had once again been granted something sacred, a flicker of trust from a creature who had once been stripped of his right to feel safe. As Rook lay still on the blanket near the fireplace, his eyes half closed, but ears still subtly angled toward every sound, Thomas knew the dog remained in a state of quiet vigilance. Not panic, but not yet at ease. That cautious breakfast had been only the first step. He understood trust didn't arrive in the morning, just as pain couldn't be erased with a moment of kindness. Later that day, after the sun had dipped behind the pine ridge, and the cabin was bathed in the deep orange glow of the firelight, Thomas decided to try brushing Rook's fur. Not to clean him, at least not yet. It was still too early for that. This was just to check for any wounds in need of tending. He didn't use the heavy grooming brush. Instead, he chose an old wooden comb, wide-toothed, gentle, with no sharp edges. He didn't approach Rook directly. He sat down first, calmly letting the dog see the object in his hand, then slowly inched closer, pausing between each movement, giving Rook time to observe, decide, and retreat if he needed to. Rook didn't bolt. He shifted from lying on his side to lying on his belly, turning his head away but keeping his eyes locked on Thomas. No growling, no overt fear, but his entire body pulled taut, like a string so tight it might snap with one wrong stroke. Thomas didn't touch his back immediately. He let the comb brush lightly against the fur near Rook's shoulder, an area with no visible trauma, and moved slowly, always in the direction of the coat. For a few minutes, everything seemed to go well. Loose hair and caked dirt fell away, revealing patches of coarse skin underneath. But as Thomas's hand drifted toward the hip, just below the injured rear leg, Rook's body jolted violently. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat. Not a growl of warning, but a deep, reflexive noise born from something much older than the present moment. Thomas stopped immediately. He set the comb down and leaned to the side, trying to get a clearer look at the spot where the dog had flinched. And then he saw them. Beneath the thick fur and layers of grime, there were circular scars, not from bites nor accidents. They were almost uniform in size, with crisp edges. Some had faded with time, others were raw, barely healed. A few overlapped in twisted patterns, but the more Thomas stared, the clearer it became. These were burns, made by electricity or heat, inflicted intentionally. The kind meant to break fear, to train through torment. Thomas didn't touch the scars. He only looked, his eyes darkening, as if something inside him had been yanked back through time. He had seen marks like these before, on other animals, in another place, a place he had passed through, witnessed, and not stopped. He stood up and walked quietly to the small table by the window, where his worn leather notebook always waited. It wasn't a diary for dates, but a place to store the things he couldn't say out loud. Thomas sat down, turned to the next blank page, and picked up his pen. He didn't write much, just a few lines, but the letters trembled. The strokes were shaky, even though his hand tried hard to remain steady. Why didn't I speak up back then? I saw. I knew. How many more like him have I walked away from? He stopped. He couldn't go further, because if he did, what would pour out would be anger tangled with guilt. And right now, the only thing he had to hold steady was stillness, to not scare off the fragile creature who had just begun to set one trembling foot on the path toward trust. Meanwhile, Rook remained on the blanket near the fire. He didn't run when Thomas walked away, didn't howl, didn't follow with his eyes, but his gaze was wider than usual, as if he could sense that something had been uncovered, and something else had shifted in the cabin's air. That night, Thomas didn't write another word. He didn't try brushing again either, but he kept the fire burning until long past midnight. Even as the flames dimmed, They were still bright enough to reveal the wounds Rook carried, not just on his skin, but in the way he breathed, moved, and stayed silent in moments that should have felt safe, because some wounds don't bleed, but they cannot be hidden. Night had deepened. The fire had reduced to glowing coals, and the cabin was so still it felt like even the nails in the floorboards were holding their breath. Thomas sat near his closed journal, eyes quietly fixed on the blanket where Rook lay. The words he had written still pulsed in his mind, not because the ink hadn't dried, but because the shame behind them had not. The round burns on Rook's back were more than old injuries. They were an answer, a living proof of the day Thomas had known, and chosen silence. The next morning, as light filtered through the trembling pine branches outside the porch, Thomas decided to try brushing Rook again. Not to search, not to probe, but to continue the work of healing, an effort both of them had silently agreed to, even if neither had the words to say so. He knew each attempt was a step into a minefield of memory, but he also understood. If he never dared touch the pain, he would never reach the trust that lay beyond it. Rook lay near the window, where the soft light fell gently on his mud-streaked fur. He didn't back away when he saw the comb in Thomas's hand. Instead of retreating like he once had, he simply watched, still alert, still cautious but no longer backing down. Thomas sat beside him, kept his breathing even, and began again at the shoulder, where touch had already proven safe. The movements were slow and soundless, but as the comb edged down toward the old fracture near the right hind leg, everything shattered in a single instant. Rook growled. It wasn't loud, it didn't last, but it hit the cabin like a nightmare that never fully faded. His eyes clouded, no longer seeing Thomas but something darker, something older. In a blink, Rook sprang upright and bolted to the corner of the room, knocking over a wooden chair and pressing himself against the wall, where the shadows lay thickest. His body shook, not from pain, but from the memory that had just surged up from beneath the surface. He didn't bark, didn't snarl, he just stood there, every muscle tight, as if bracing for the next blow, the next command, the next moment someone would remind him that he was nothing, not even worth a name. Thomas didn't follow, didn't speak, didn't try to soothe. He simply stayed where he was, seated exactly where he had been, his left hand resting on his knee, and his right hand slowly turning upward, open, empty. That open hand may have seemed like nothing, but in the world of a wounded animal, it was everything, a white flag, a sign of surrender, not to weakness, but to patience. No force, no demand, no deal, just presence. 10 minutes passed, long as a night without light. Still, as if the world had forgotten to breathe, Thomas didn't move. And Rook, who had frozen at first, slowly began to lower his body. His ears flattened, tail lowered, eyes never left the hand, this time holding no leash, no treat, no punishment, just skin and warmth, offered without expectation. Finally, he stepped forward. Not quickly. Each step was a brush against the fear. His head stayed low, body cautious like wading through mud made of memory. Every movement risked sinking back into everything he had once lost. When Rook stopped, Thomas still hadn't looked directly at him. His eyes remained on the far wall, where the light cast faint shadows across the planks. The dog pressed his muzzle gently into the open hand, just for a moment. A brief, breath-like gesture. Not submission, not seeking comfort, but something quieter. A sign that he still had the strength to touch kindness, even if just once. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was more than fear. It was exhaustion, of always living on high alert. Rook held that position for a few seconds. Then he pulled away. He didn't return to the corner, didn't collapse at Thomas's feet like dogs who knew they were home. But he stayed, just a little to the side, lying near the porch wall, watching, breathing, slower now, deeper. Thomas set the comb back on the table and poured himself a glass of water. He didn't need to write in the journal that night. Everything that needed to be recorded had already been written. In the silence, in the hesitation, in Rook's eyes. Some growls don't come from the throat. They echo from the subconscious. And some wounds can't be healed by words, only by patience that expects nothing in return. After that fateful morning, when Rook, weighed down by exhaustion, gently placed his muzzle in Thomas's open hand, quietly admitting that he no longer had the strength to keep resisting, the air in the cabin began to shift. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but something had loosened. Rook's posture softened with each afternoon as firelight flickered in his eyes. And Thomas, though he never said a word, had begun walking more gently, as if he too was learning to live again beside a creature so fragile that even a touch had to be carefully considered. That day, the noon sun brought rare warmth to the Laurel Mountains. Not harsh, just enough for the pine trees to exhale their sweet resin scent, and for the wind to carry the soft breath of late spring's earth. Thomas was stacking firewood by the porch when he heard a knock. Light but firm, a sound that hadn't visited this cabin in years. He frowned slightly, still holding a piece of wood, and walked inside, eyes flicking toward Rook, who lay beneath the table, eyes half-lidded but ears perked, as always. The door creaked open just a crack, and the first voice wasn't that of an adult, but something brighter, lighter, a little shy, but full of curiosity. "Hi, Mr. Thomas. My mom made cookies. I brought you some." Standing on the porch was a girl, maybe 8 years old, with braided hair and a tin box wrapped in a tea towel. It was Lily, the neighbor's daughter from across the pines, about a mile away. The same Lily who sometimes wandered into Thomas's memory whenever he spotted chalk scribbles on stones by the creek. He nodded and accepted the box with a rare but genuine smile. Lily didn't step inside. She peered into the cabin, eyes scanning the sparse furnishings, until they landed on another pair of eyes watching her from within. Under the table near the fireplace, Rook had, by instinct, retreated deeper into the shadows. His eyes were wide, back arched, nose twitching rapidly to analyze this new scent. He didn't growl, didn't bark, but his entire body folded in on itself like dry wood waiting to snap. Lily crouched slightly, trying to see better. Thomas spoke before she could move. "Best not get too close. He's still scared of strangers." She gave a small nod, and then, instead of approaching, she sat down on the doorstep, legs dangling, and pulled a small biscuit from her pocket. "I'll just leave this here," she said gently. "If he doesn't want it, that's okay too." The gesture stopped Thomas cold, not because it was extraordinary, but because of how much respect it held, coming from someone so small. Lily didn't wave or call out. She didn't coax him in a high voice or try to reach out like most people would when they saw a dog. She simply sat quietly, eyes calm, hand placing the cookie on the floor, then withdrawing to give space. And at that moment, something unexpected happened. From under the table, Rook's head emerged, slowly, cautiously, as if testing the very air before moving further. His eyes were locked on the girl, but they no longer held the sharp edge of fear. There was something else now. Surprise, wariness, and something even rarer, a glimmer of curiosity. The cookie lay just a stride away, caught in the shaft of light between them. Lily, despite the urge to wave or speak, didn't move an inch. Rook sniffed the air, then pulled back. But he didn't retreat. He didn't hide. Instead, his tail, after days of being tucked beneath him, twitched. Thomas stood still. He had seen this dog convulse in his sleep. He had heard the low, haunted sounds Rook made when metal clanged in the kitchen. He had watched the dog's eyes darken from just a knock on the door. But never had he seen that tail move for any reason other than fear. It wasn't a wag, not really. Not the kind you see when a dog is joyful and free. It was a slight tremor, just enough for the sunlight to catch it, and cast a flickering shadow on the wooden floor. But to Thomas, to Rook, and to the little girl sitting on the doorstep, it was everything, like the first hint of spring melting into old snow. No one said anything. Lily left the cookie where it was, gave Thomas a soft smile, and skipped back down the pine-covered path. Thomas watched her go, then stepped inside, and quietly closed the door, but not before glancing under the table one more time. Rook was no longer curled into a tight ball. He had stood up, licked the last crumb from the floor, and looked up at Thomas, not with fear, but with something that almost resembled a question. And Thomas, for the first time that day, laughed. It was a hoarse, brief sound, but it shook the air inside the cabin like the first chord of a new song. Because sometimes it's not the grown-ups with grand compassion, but a child, quiet, unassuming, asking for nothing but peace, who touches the softest place in a soul long since shattered. Since the afternoon Lily stopped by, the heaviness inside the cabin had lifted slightly. Not completely, but enough. Rook's eyes had softened when Thomas moved around. He no longer flinched at the creaking floorboards or the clink of bowls. He still lay where he could see the exit, but for the first time, his eyes didn't only carry the instinct to flee. They began to show the faintest trace of someone testing the idea of staying. So when night fell and the wind began to whistle gently against the old tin roof, Thomas expected it to be another quiet evening. He rekindled the fire, checked the door locks, and topped off the kettle on the stove. Rook had eaten early and now lay curled on the blanket by the window bench, head resting against the chair leg, an unspoken sign that this space was no longer foreign. But just as all sound had settled into the soft crackle of embers, a noise broke through the stillness. 3 knocks, slow, deep, and heavy. Thomas looked up immediately. So did Rook. But what caught Thomas's attention wasn't just the knock. It was how Rook reacted. The dog rose, not hesitantly, but with purpose, stepping in front of Thomas like a silent shield. No barking, no growling, just a stance. Ears flattened, posture stiff, gaze locked on the door, as if his entire body remembered something no one else in the room did. Thomas didn't rush. He stepped forward slowly, brushing his hand over Rook's back, and felt the hackles standing on end. When he unlatched the door and cracked it open, a figure stood there. Brown coat, dusty shoulders, a hat pulled low, and a metal badge catching the dull glint of the porch light. Deputy Marshal Lance Dwyer. Not quite a friend, not a stranger either. There was something between them, an unspoken distance, built from old truths both men agreed not to revisit. Dwyer lifted his hat slightly, his eyes flicking inside the cabin once before returning to Thomas. "Sorry to come so late," he said, voice low. "Thought you ought to know. Someone broke into the old Wilcox property. Deep boot prints, barn doors tore open, big truck tires in the mud." Thomas said nothing. The wind pressed against the doorway, making Rook shiver. But the dog didn't step back. "We didn't find anything taken," Dwyer added. "But it feels like someone's coming back. Could be poachers. Or someone looking for something they buried." And when the name Wilcox was spoken aloud, Rook reacted. He didn't bark, didn't bolt. He simply moved forward, past Thomas, not blocking, not threatening, but unwilling to retreat. His back stiffened, head lowered, his eyes shifted from wary to something deeper, something that suggested this name wasn't new. It was familiar, worn, and each time it was spoken it left a fresh scratch on old memory. Thomas saw it instantly. He crouched and placed a hand gently on Rook's neck. The dog didn't pull away. He stood firm, like a pillar in the wind. Dwyer watched in silence, then pulled a business card from his coat and set it on the table by the door. "If you remember anything about Wilcox or see anything strange, call." Thomas nodded. No promises. Dwyer tipped his hat again and disappeared into the trees. Only after his silhouette faded behind the branches did Thomas close the door. The cabin was silent again, but not the same silence as before. This one carried weight, like the wind had brought back something it couldn't name. Rook still stood facing the door, tail down, front legs trembling slightly. Thomas didn't urge him to lie down. He didn't say a word. He only returned to the fireplace, added wood to the flames, and quietly placed a new blanket nearby. And when Rook finally turned, slowly walking toward the fire and curling up again, Thomas knew this night would be longer than most. Not because of the wind, not because of the name Wilcox, but because that dog, after days of crawling out of darkness, had just reminded him that some names, even without explanation, can make a soul tremble all over again. After the cabin door closed and the chill of night was stopped at the wooden threshold, Thomas didn't return to his usual seat by the fire. He stood still for a long while, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular, but his mind reaching into something deeper than what Deputy Dwyer had just said. Rook lay near the fire, not curled as in previous nights. His eyes remained open, chin resting on his front paws, breath steady but shallow, as if he too were waiting for something unnamed. Outside, the wind continued to tap against the cabin walls like insistent knocks. Thomas turned toward the back door, the path overgrown with weeds leading to the storage shed, a place he had once vowed never to revisit. But tonight, without hesitation, he put on a coat, slid into his old boots, and walked heavily across the soft ground. The shed was a weathered block of wood, nearly swallowed by the trees behind the cabin. Inside, it smelled of rust, dust, and something between ashes and memory. Thomas flicked on a flashlight, its beam landing in a dark corner of an old metal box, half covered by a rotting silver tarp. The edges of the box were dented, the hinges rusted, but the lock was still intact. He knelt, pulling a small key from his coat pocket, the same key he had carried since his army days, not because he needed it, but because he had never been able to let it go. The lock snapped open with a soft click, but the sound echoed like an explosion in the stillness, stirring something long buried. Slowly, Thomas lifted the lid. Inside were fragments of life tucked away. A faded cap, a unit-marked notebook, unsent letters, folded invoices, a few black and white photos, and a camouflage jacket with a singed patch on the left shoulder. He didn't rummage in any order. His hand moved across the items like one touching old scars. Then he stopped at a bundle of documents tied together with string. The edges of the pages had yellowed, and in the corner was the faded stamp of a private company, Yellowstone Livestock Holdings. Beneath the company name, in lighter ink, it read, Headquarters, Wilcox Ranch, Montana. Thomas opened it. The typed words hit with a mechanical chill. Shipment invoices, payment slips for unnamed deliveries, lists of crate numbers. And at the bottom, a black and white photograph. Two men shaking hands beside a truck full of iron cages. One wore a leather jacket. The other's face was obscured. Underneath the image, handwritten in blue ink, Everett Rohr. The name made Thomas's heart slow by a beat, not because it caught him off guard, but because it confirmed what he had always known. Just chosen to bury. Rohr had once run the Wilcox facility and had once hired Thomas to fix pens, move crates, and keep quiet. Back then, Thomas was young, broke, and didn't ask questions. He didn't look closely, just finished the job and walked away. But he had seen, had heard, and had chosen to look away. Among the scattered papers, one special intake form slipped out, tracking a shipment from an unnamed facility to Wilcox Ranch. The note scribbled in the margin, though water-stained, was still readable. Canine 1479, not aggressive when removed from the group, requires retraining in response to human presence. Thomas stopped breathing. His hand trembled slightly as he looked beneath the line, where a still image from a surveillance camera was clipped. A German shepherd standing in a cage, eyes dull, with a thin metal tag around his neck marked 1479. No one needed to explain. No comparison was necessary. It was Rook, Everything became clear, like a map that had been flipped upside down finally turned the right way. Thomas sat down on the dirt floor of the shed, the paper lying beside his foot, the flashlight beam still casting harsh white light across the file's glossy surface. In that instant, he was back to that afternoon, years ago, when he was the man walking past metal kennels, never really looking into the eyes of the shivering dogs, never asking why they were locked up, never asking where they had come from. But now, one of those animals was lying in his cabin, alive, bearing on his body the scars Thomas had once walked away from. No one had forced him to open the box. No one had asked him to face this. But Rook had looked at him. Not with blame, but with a quiet yearning to be understood. And it was that look that told Thomas, this time, he was not allowed to look away again. He gathered the documents, wrapped them in the old camouflage jacket, and locked the box. When Thomas returned to the cabin, Rook was still lying by the fire. He lifted his head as the door opened, eyes following Thomas's steps without flinching. There was no howl, no unease, only a look of waiting, calm, and deeper than any spoken question. Thomas placed the wrapped file on the table and sat down silently by the fire. The space became so still he could hear the faint sound of ashes collapsing. And Rook, without being called, slowly walked over, lay down beside him, and gently rested his chin on the back of Thomas's relaxed hand resting on his knee. No one needed to mention Everett Roar again. His presence was already there. In Rook's eyes, in the yellowed pages of those documents, in Thomas's chest, and in the night wind beginning to turn over the roof of that old cabin built for survivors. The morning after, before the mist had lifted from the cabin's roof, Rook was already awake, his eyes fixed on the forest, as if something had quietly stirred him from within his subconscious. Thomas sat on the porch steps, his fingers wrapped tightly around a cup of cold coffee. In front of him lay the folder opened the night before, but instead of reading it again, he simply looked, waiting, as if those pages might speak on their own. There had been no real sleep through the night. Only fragmented flashes of memory returned each time the fire dimmed and Rook's eyes suddenly opened, gazing at him like a mirror, one that bore no resentment, yet refused to let him look away. When Rook stood, he didn't glance at Thomas, nor did he look back at the door. He walked straight behind the cabin, slipping silently onto the overgrown path that led toward the old ranch. Thomas followed him with his eyes, then rose and went after him without a word. No one called, and no sound passed between the two survivors, but every step held an unspoken agreement, as if both of them understood this path had to be reopened with the very courage that once turned away from it. Through tangled bushes and fallen fences, they returned to Wilcox, the place that had once been a livestock ranch, now no more than a skeleton slowly swallowed by the forest. Rook crossed the weedy clearing, passing broken barns and pens without pause, heading deeper toward the rear field, the old freight yard for goods and equipment. He moved with a strange certainty, as though the scent of something buried had never left his memory. At a patch of tall, sparse grass, Rook stopped. He didn't whine, didn't dig. He just stood still, nose to the ground, body slightly hunched. Thomas halted behind him, watched for a moment, then stepped forward, knelt beside him, and began digging slowly with his hands, pushing aside damp earth one handful at a time. Rook sat nearby, eyes locked on every clump of soil being overturned. The smell of dirt rose thick and heavy, the smell of rot, of time, and of truth long buried. Thomas dug slowly but steadily. After a few minutes, his fingers hit something cold and hard, the rusted edge of a metal box wrapped in the remains of rotted plastic sheeting. He lifted it out, placed it on drier ground, and opened the lid. Inside were photographs, yellowed with age, yet still clear enough to freeze his breath. Dogs, bound, locked in cages smaller than their bodies, collars fitted with wires, and electrodes on their hips. Each photo was tagged with numbers, each one snapped like evidence, like confiscated property. None of them looked the same, but all shared the same expression: the eyes of those who had lost the ability to trust. Besides the photographs were transaction files, labeled with code notations, transfer logs, and records of training milestones, marked by sterile phrases. No resistance, strong shock response, successfully conditioned, unmanageable, transfer for disposal. At the bottom of the stack was a list of personnel. Thomas picked it up. Every name carried a title: equipment supplier, handler, technician, logistics coordinator. His eyes stopped near the bottom. Thomas Miller, support for transport and enclosure, May that year. No address, no ID number. But it was him. Undeniably. The wind rustled overhead. The sky hung heavy, the color of ash, but Thomas remained still, staring at his name. Not just as an identity, but now as evidence of silence. He hadn't inflicted the damage directly, but he had been there. He had seen. He had walked away. Rook didn't look at the documents. He simply sat, head tilted toward Thomas, his gaze neither angry nor accusing, but heavy. The way he breathed, slow and steady, spoke louder than any judgment. Thomas returned the papers to the box. He didn't throw them out. He didn't burn them. He didn't hide them again. They were no longer evidence to be avoided, but the beginning of a reckoning that could no longer be delayed. He cradled the box in his arms and stood, and when he turned to go, Rook followed behind without a word, as if he knew this return was no longer something Thomas would have to face alone. No words were exchanged on the way back to the cabin, but when they reached the doorstep, Rook stopped, then stepped ahead of Thomas and gently touched his nose to the metal box in the man's hands. Not to inspect, not to reject. Just once more, in the language of a creature who never learned to lie, Rook said the only thing that mattered: "You are not alone in bearing the weight of what was buried." When Thomas placed the metal box on the table, dust from the cloth wrapper fell in faint fragments, forming a blurry circle around the truth that had been buried for far too long. He didn't open the lid again. Everything that needed to be seen was already etched into his memory. Rook stood by his side, unmoving, eyes following every gesture as if watching for the first sign of a decision even he couldn't name. No howl, no urging nudge, but those eyes, quiet, steady, spoke a silent reminder that pain doesn't need pity. It just needs someone to stand up and do the right thing. And Thomas understood. Rook didn't need him to apologize. Didn't need pretty words to erase the past. He needed action. That afternoon, as the last light of day filtered through thick pine branches, Thomas packed a few things into the pickup truck. Old case files, the metal box, a new, softer leash for Rook, and most importantly, a silence that no longer carried the weight of avoidance, but of preparation. He didn't say much, just patted the side of the truck, and Rook jumped into the passenger seat, sitting tall, but no longer tense. Maybe he didn't understand where they were going, but those eyes, calm and accepting, showed he was ready. The truck shuddered slightly as it pulled away from the dirt path circling the cabin, cutting through the golden-leafed forest of late fall. Thomas didn't turn on the radio. The air inside the vehicle was thick with needed silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because some things don't need words when both already understand. Nearly an hour later, they reached Bozeman, the town where Thomas had once lived as someone else. A place where he had walked past people he didn't dare to hold on to. Alina Merrick's veterinary clinic stood quietly on a corner street. Modest, with wide windows and a weather-worn sign that still offered enough warmth to let people feel they wouldn't be judged for walking in. Thomas parked and took the leash, but didn't tug. He opened the passenger door and looked at Rook, who stepped down on his own, gently testing with his front paw before shifting weight to his back leg, still limping. They walked in together like two old friends who didn't need to talk to stay in step. As Thomas pushed open the clinic door, The smell of antiseptic mixed with dried floral tea hit him, a scent so familiar it made him pause. The nurse at the desk looked up, froze for a beat, then disappeared behind the curtain without asking for a name. Moments later, Alina Merrick emerged from behind the white curtain, hands still wiping dry, hair in a loose bun, no makeup, but eyes so bright Thomas had to look away. But she didn't ask anything. Her gaze drifted down to Rook, who stood close beside him, neither shrinking back nor stepping forward. Alina didn't crouch immediately. She knelt on one knee, bringing herself eye-level with Rook, and extended her hand, slowly, without touching, without forcing, letting him choose. After a few moments, Rook stepped forward. His nose dipped gently to her open palm, then stayed still, just enough to probe, and enough to trust. She nodded and rose to her feet, her voice soft but steady. "Come in. I need a closer look." In a small room lit by soft golden light from the window, Alina examined every joint, every patch of lost fur, gently lifting layers of scarred skin. Under magnification, the burns became clearer, precise circular patterns, patches where fur would never grow back. Thomas sat across from her, silent, watching like a man listening to the verdict of a part of his life being uncovered layer by layer. When she exhaled, Thomas knew he was about to hear what he had already suspected. These weren't from an accident, not from poor shelter. These were deliberate, repeated. Thomas clenched his fists, eyes falling to the cold tile floor. Alina didn't press further. She simply placed a gentle hand on Rook's head, then looked at Thomas, her voice lower. "Bringing him here was the right thing. But if he's ever going to truly heal, you have to bring into the light what he can't say for himself." Thomas nodded. His hand reached into his coat pocket where the old file sat. He pulled it out, laid it on the table and slid it toward her. "This is everything I once turned my back on." No one spoke after that. Rook lay there, head resting on the rug, eyes half closed, chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. That breath was the only sound in the room filled with silence, and in that moment Thomas knew that the truth may have been buried, but it had always been breathing, slow, deep, and waiting for someone brave enough to listen. When Thomas slid the folder towards Alina, her eyes paused on the pages stained by old tears, their edges curled from moisture. For a brief moment, no one said a word. Rook lay by Thomas's foot, not alert, but still holding a quiet awareness, as if he knew what had just been placed on the table wasn't just paper, but the end of a bone buried too long. Alina carefully flipped through the pages. She didn't react with gasps or sighs. Her eyes just deepened, page by page, until she stopped at a faded photo showing a metal-tagged dog inside a cage. 1479. She turned to Thomas, voice low as if weighing between professional restraint and moral obligation. "Did you know he might have a chip?" Thomas shook his head. "Didn't cross my mind." Alina stood, pulled a scanner from a drawer, and knelt. Her hand moved gently along the scruff of Rook's neck, where identity chips are usually placed. A soft beep sounded, and the screen blinked to life. A sequence of digits appeared, followed by a retrieval of old data most believed had long been erased. The screen showed a name, registration site, intake date, and finally, a line that froze the room in place. Owner, Everett Roar, Wilcox Livestock Holdings. Alina didn't say anything. She just stared at the screen, as if every character was etching back something that should never have been forgotten. When she turned to Thomas, the shock in her eyes wasn't just horror at the fact, but something colder, the realization that this truth had once lived among them, passed before their eyes, and may have been ignored by many. Thomas didn't move, didn't blink. That name, Everett Roar, fell into the room like a stone to his chest, not because it surprised him, but because he had known, had heard, had seen, and had stayed silent. The memories surged like floodwater through a cracked dam. A man with a voice sharp as knives, who always wore an unmarked coat and smiled sideways while giving orders, never touching the animals himself. The invoices Thomas had signed. The metal crates were hauled away in the night. The high-pitched cries from the storage barn he pretended not to hear. Rook still lay quietly, eyes locked on Thomas. And those eyes, now clearer, seemed to understand. This revelation wasn't a shock to Thomas. It was a mirror, forcing him to look. And Thomas didn't look away. He held his gaze steady, a silent acknowledgement that this truth had never been gone, only waiting to be called by name. Alina sat down, picked up the file again, and glanced once more at the screen. You knew him. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded. Worked with him. When I needed the money. When I didn't dare ask. And now? Thomas didn't answer right away. He looked at Rook, then spoke softly, almost only loud enough for the two souls in the room to hear. Now I have to find him. Not for revenge, but because I owe it to him, and to every creature that man turned into an object. A real ending. Alina nodded slowly. No more questions are needed. In Thomas's eyes, there was no room left for doubt. And in Rook's eyes, silence had become something else. Companionship. A companionship deeper than any leash or command. A bond between two wounded souls, no longer willing to carry it alone. When they stepped out of the clinic, Thomas didn't look around, didn't speak to Rook, who walked silently beside him. But inside, everything had changed. The name Everett Roar was no longer a shadow from memory, no longer a shame buried by time. It was now the lifeblood of a story still unfolding, and he, once the man who turned away, was now rewriting its ending with the same hands that had once stayed still. The pickup rumbled south of Bozeman, over rugged roads edging the forest. Thomas didn't need GPS or directions. The address had been in his memory for over 10 years, though he'd tried to forget it. Marcus Lathan, the man who once ran the dog training section at Wilcox Ranch, who disappeared not long after the place was shut down, but who kept to his old habit of hiding near the old industrial zone by the woods, where no one asked questions if you didn't ask first. Thomas stopped in front of an old warehouse converted into a living space. Rook sat still in the passenger seat, eyes fixed on the front door. When Thomas got out, Rook followed. No leash, no command. The two moved like shadows tied together, cautious, but not retreating. Marcus opened the door after 3 knocks, no sooner, no later. His face was angular, patchy beard, eyes sunken but sharp with wary intelligence. When he saw Thomas, he paused, then squinted. I figured you were dead, or living like someone who is. Thomas didn't respond, just nodded slightly. Rook stepped forward, placing himself between Thomas and Marcus. Marcus's eyes locked onto the dog, then grew serious. A long, tense stare. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider. Come in, but if he starts growling, I'm not responsible. Inside the sparse room, just a desk, a broken-armed chair, and a cold teapot, Thomas sat across from Marcus. Rook lay at his feet, eyes open, ears slightly raised as if hearing things no one else could. Marcus leaned against the wall, pulled out an unlit cigarette, rolling it between his fingers. You're here about Roar. Thomas nodded. And the dog? This time Thomas didn't answer immediately. He pulled a copy of the file from his coat, placed it on the table, and looked straight at Marcus. He belonged to the ranch. ID 1479. He's on the record, chipped, and marked with scars that need no explanation. Marcus didn't touch the papers. His eyes stayed on Rook, and then he sighed. He was one of the special ones. Thomas frowned. Special how? Marcus ground the unlit cigarette into the table, as if deciding the story didn't need it. Because he didn't do what we wanted. The others, after a few weeks of shocks, starvation, and being forced to fight, they'd turn, bite on command, attack without pause. But Rook didn't. Thomas froze. Rook didn't move, only breathed slower. He endured, but he never bit, never reacted on cue, Never let himself become a tool. We called him the mute, defiant one. Marcus's gaze drifted, then came back deeper. And you know Roar didn't tolerate that. Dogs like Rook were considered failures. No profit, no spectacle. But instead of putting him down, he kept him. Made him watch the fights. Made him eat beside cages of the wounded or dead. That kind of thing, you understand, is a punishment far beyond physical pain. Thomas clenched his hands under the table. The wood creaked under his grip. And then what? Marcus exhaled. One time I saw Rook standing between two dogs forced to fight, getting beaten to rile them up. He didn't run, didn't bite. He just stood there, and the look he gave me, it felt like a creature putting me on trial. The room went still, not from lack of words, but because neither man knew which ones would be right. After a long pause, Thomas spoke, voice low and cracked like wind over dry leaves. He survived, and now I want to bring that bastard into the light. Marcus leaned back, eyes closed. Roar didn't stay in Montana. After the ranch shut down, he scrubbed the records, paid off a few people, and vanished. But I've heard he didn't stop. Moved somewhere else, changed company names, brought in new muscle. Thomas stood. His gaze was no longer that of a man seeking redemption, but one carrying the weight of responsibility to end a cycle. Rook stood too, unprompted. Give me a name. A lead. Anything. Marcus stayed silent, then bent down and pulled a worn notebook from under the table. He flipped through a few pages, tore one out, and handed it over. This is a place I heard he turned up. No guarantees. But it's what I've got. Thomas took it. His eyes met Rook's in silent affirmation. They weren't stopping here. Marcus watched them leave, then murmured a final thought, more to his conscience than to them. If anyone has the right to end this, it's him, not us. As the pickup pulled away from Marcus's hideout, Thomas said nothing. The slip of paper with the handwritten address lay tucked inside his shirt pocket, damp with sweat, and pressed to his chest like a reminder that couldn't be erased. Rook sat beside him, eyes locked on the rough stone road ahead. They both understood. This wasn't just tracking a lead anymore. It was the beginning of the confrontation. But before going further, Thomas knew there was one place he had to return to: Wilcox Ranch. Not because he believed Roar was still there, but because something on that land remained unsaid. Something that made Rook pause every time they passed, not barking, not howling, just standing still like a statue bearing the language of endurance. They returned to the ranch in a gray afternoon. Clouds hung low over the hills, and the air carried a mist so thin it wrapped the land like mourning cloth. Thomas parked near the woods, avoiding the main gate and circling the collapsed fencing near the back pens. Rook led by a few steps, his movement slow but decisive, nose low to the earth, ears tilted slightly and reflexes honed by fear. They hadn't walked more than 10 minutes when Rook froze, just for a split second. A faint nod, a sudden turn, and then the sound. Rustling behind the old barn, followed by rapid footsteps breaking through the underbrush. No warning, no shout, just a hard shove from behind that threw Thomas off balance. Rook launched forward before Thomas could recover. Two figures burst out from either side, one with a metal pipe, the other swinging a wooden bat toward Thomas's gut. The strike missed, but Thomas fell backward, damp earth pressing against his spine. Rook threw his full weight between him and the attackers, growling loud and deep. The first strike staggered one man, but the other brought his weapon down on Rook's back. A dull, sickening thud followed by a choked grunt. But Rook didn't back down. His body radiated something more than resistance. This wasn't a dog fighting attackers. It was a memory awakened and striking back. This time, he refused to be silent. Thomas scrambled up. His hand reached for the old utility knife still strapped to his belt from his service days. He didn't stab, just raised it as a warning. But one of them lunged, recklessly like an animal cornered. In that flash, instinct took over. Thomas didn't kill, but when the blade nicked the man's arm, Blood splattered against his old brown coat. The scent of iron mingled with the quake in his chest. The attacker howled, then stumbled back, dragging his partner as they fled into the trees. No threats, no looking back, but in their panic, Thomas knew. They weren't random thugs. They were Roar's men, or those still trying to keep his secrets buried. Rook stood, his back slightly arched, panting hard. Blood stained his left shoulder, running in a thin stream through his fur and soaking into his chest. Thomas dropped to his knees. His hands didn't tremble, but his heart pounded wild. He pressed his palm to the wound, not deep, but enough to raise every hair around it in pain. Rook didn't howl, didn't whimper. He just looked at Thomas with bloodshot eyes, not from rage, but from something rising within him, something his captors had once tried to train but never understood, not the rage of a wounded animal, but the instinct to protect, of a soul that never stopped standing up for someone else. Thomas said nothing, just laid his hand on Rook's head and gently pressed his forehead to the dog's. A moment shared, two survivors' breath mingling in the ache, in the tears that hadn't yet fallen. On the way back to the cabin, the truck jolted over potholes. Rook lay quiet in the back seat, bandaged with clean cloth and Thomas's coat. Every time Thomas checked the mirror, he saw Rook awake. Not tense, not afraid, just watching, guarding him. That night, by firelight, as Thomas cleaned and treated Rook's wounds, laying him gently on a warm blanket by the hearth, he never looked away. He knew, if he'd gone alone today, the one lying there might have been him. Or maybe, he'd never get a second chance to face his soul and keep living. But now, they were both back, with blood, with new scars, and with a resolve that could not be shaken. Whoever had sent men to that ranch would soon learn that the game had changed, and Rook, once trained to be a weapon, had made his choice. He chose to be a shield. The night after the ambush, when the cabin had sunk into a silence broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and Rook's heavy, exhausted breathing, Thomas sat alone at the old wooden table. Beside him was the metal box, now cleaned, the documents sorted, the photographs pressed flat again, every page clipped together by hand. A slow, patient act of atonement. There was no more doubt. What he held was not just memory, but evidence, and it was time to let it leave the borders of this cabin and speak out loud. The next morning, with mist still drifting among the pine branches, Thomas slipped on his coat, resting a hand gently on Rook's head. The dog stirred only slightly, eyes following him, but didn't rise. The wound on his left shoulder had been disinfected thoroughly, but his gaze still held that guarded edge, as if he wasn't fully convinced the storm had passed. Thomas leaned down, whispered something into Rook's ear, a vow with no words, then stepped outside, carrying a bag full of truths long buried. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Office wasn't far, but the road there had never felt heavier. Deputy Dwyer gave him a cautious look as Thomas stepped through the door. In town, people still remembered the auction, the man who quietly raised his hand for a limping dog. But no one expected the silence behind that act to contain so much darkness. Thomas didn't sit. He placed the fabric bag on the table and unpacked its contents piece by piece. Documents, stacks of papers, photographs, recordings, images that couldn't be denied, receipts with real signatures. And then, he opened an old phone and played a video someone had once captured. An auction in Billings. In the shaky frame, a German shepherd walked into the light, back arched, rear legs dragging. No one raised a hand. No one spoke. Just a cold hush, until one hand, Thomas's hand, rose quietly. The auctioneer slammed the gavel. The camera shook slightly as the person filming gasped. "That's Rook," Thomas said softly. But that was only the beginning. This is the rest. He pulled out another phone, showing scar images and a microchip scan, and linked it to a registry file naming Everett Roar, the man who once ran Wilcox Ranch and had since disappeared. Dwyer didn't speak for a long time. His fingers gently touched the scattered papers, then slowly gathered them into a pile. "I'm calling the state," he said, "and reopening the federal warrant." Thomas nodded, but there was no relief in his face. He simply stood, but before he left, he looked back at the deputy one last time. Roar didn't just vanish. He was protected. Someone let this happen. Those dogs didn't disappear on their own. And Rook, he's not the only one. Dwyer remained silent, then slowly nodded. They won't be silent anymore. Within 24 hours, the auction video resurfaced across social media. But this time, it didn't stand alone. It came with a thread of documented facts, photos of injuries, excerpts from reports, and the microchip registration, captioned with one simple line. "This isn't a heartwarming rescue story. This is a living witness." Someone added white text over the footage. "Silence once killed them. Don't let it do it again." Rook still lay on the blanket by the fireplace, his head resting on crossed paws, ears flicking faintly when the phone buzzed with another alert. Thomas sat in the chair opposite, eyes locked on the dancing flames, like thoughts too restless to sleep. He knew now there was no going back to a life of quiet solitude, because what had been brought into the light demanded they walk deeper into the dark, where the man who caused the pain wasn't just a ghost from the past, but a threat still watching. But this time, Thomas wasn't alone, and Rook, though never trained to be a hero, had chosen that role a long time ago. News of the auction spread faster than Thomas expected. The next morning, just as he poured hot water into the coffee pot, there was a knock at the door, soft but certain. He opened it to see Lily, the neighbor girl with wind-tangled blonde hair, standing there in a thick coat smelling of forest and earth. Thomas blinked, surprised. He hadn't expected anyone, least of all a child, on a cold morning like this. But it wasn't her presence that caught his attention. It was the uncharacteristic seriousness in her young eyes. She wasn't smiling as she usually did. She stood still, hands gripping the hem of her coat, and asked quietly, "Do you have a moment? I want to tell you something." Thomas tilted his head. "Come in." They sat in the kitchen, still laced with wood smoke, Rook resting nearby with his head on his paws as usual. He didn't move when Lily entered, only flicked his eyes toward her, acknowledging her presence, then returned to his stillness. But Lily couldn't stop looking at him. She stared for a long time before speaking, slowly and firmly. "That time I almost fell through the ice behind the pine ridge. Rook pulled me out." Thomas's brow furrowed. "What did you say?" Lily nodded. "You didn't know. It was the day the snow was really deep. I went into the woods behind the house to look for pine cones. I got lost. Then I slipped. The ice was thin. I saw the cracks under my feet." Her voice dropped, but her eyes stayed bright as if reliving the moment. "Rook was nearby. I don't know why he was there. But when I slipped, one leg through the ice, he ran over. He didn't bark, didn't make noise, just grabbed my coat and pulled." Thomas sat frozen. In his mind, he saw Rook, limping gait, bandaged shoulder, haunted eyes once terrified of every sudden movement. A creature trained to believe human contact was dangerous. A soul once taught to tremble at human hands. And yet, at that moment, he had stepped forward, without hesitation. "He saved me," Lily said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't think I even screamed. I was too scared. But Rook wasn't. He knew I needed help." Thomas didn't answer. He turned to look at Rook. The dog was still lying there, but when Thomas's gaze met his, Rook opened his eyes. A brief, calm look, straight into Thomas's, saying silently that there was nothing extraordinary about what happened. No miracle, no glory. Just an act, an instinct. And that, Thomas realized, was what made it break his heart. Because Rook had once been trained to hurt, had been broken to obey through fear. And yet he'd done the opposite, not for reward, not from command, but from something deeper, purer, the innate goodness others had tried to beat out of him with hunger and electric pain. Thomas placed his hand on the table, gripping the cold wood. "You never told anyone?" Lily shook her head. "I wasn't sure if I imagined it. But when I saw him in the video, I knew it was real." He looked back at Rook, now stretched out, eyes half closed, quiet like the wind at dusk. But in that stillness, Thomas saw clearly. Rook was not just a victim. He was a witness, a living testament that, even when pushed into the darkest depths of cruelty, a soul can still rise and reach out to save another. No one had asked Rook to do that. No one taught him. And maybe, because no one ever taught him what was right, when he did the right thing, it wasn't out of expectation. He did it from the heart. Lily's story lingered in Thomas's mind long after she had gone home. It didn't just open a new window into Rook's past. It stirred a question that had never before found words. What if Rook wasn't the only one? What if there were others still out there, left behind in dark places, with names no one knew and eyes that had never been seen with compassion? Thomas sat on his porch that entire afternoon, with Rook beside him as always, his head resting gently on Thomas's leg. The wind passed through the pines, rustling the leaves on the roof like the whispers of spirits waiting to be released. And in that wind, a thought began to take shape, clear as the grain on old oak wood. They couldn't stop at exposing evil. They had to build something strong enough to heal. The next day, Thomas drove to the veterinary clinic, where Alina was tending to a puppy abandoned by the roadside. She saw him from afar, the same tall figure in a worn brown coat, but his eyes were different today, no longer weighed down by guilt. Instead, they held the resolve of a man who had found the answer to a silence that had haunted him all his life. "Alina," he said as he stepped inside, "I need your help. Not for me, for the other dogs." She took off her glasses and tilted her head. "Thomas, what are you thinking?" From his coat pocket, he pulled out a rough, hand-drawn sketch. A plot of land on the outskirts of Livingston, between two arms of forest, where a quiet meadow lay like a silent carpet. At the center, a large kennel, a recovery wing, and a small house. Above it, scrawled in bold ink, "Rook's Refuge." "A rescue center," he explained. "A place for dogs like Rook, ones trained to be afraid, to bite, to obey. Now they need a place where they can just be, breathe, live." Alina was silent for a while. She looked at Rook, still sitting outside the door, ears perked as if he understood every word Thomas had said. Then she nodded. "All right, I'll help. But not just me. This whole town owes him a thank you." Word of the center spread quickly, not through news or radio, but through trust. Rook's video, Lily's post, Alina's reflections, and the footage Thomas had submitted to the police. They flowed together like small streams into one larger river, a real refuge for four-legged souls who had lived too long in the dark. People began sending in old sheets of tin, leftover lumber, and even used bags of dog food and worn leashes. A veteran carpenter drove in from the next county with a toolbox and something different in his eyes. "I was like you once. Now I need to do something that matters." A high school student emailed asking to volunteer, confessing he had once abandoned a dog out of fear of responsibility and now wanted to make it right. They all came together not out of pity, but out of respect. On opening day, Rook was the first to walk through the gates of the new center. He didn't need to be led. Each step was steady and quiet, as if this place had always lived in his memory. He wandered the grassy yard, paused at each empty kennel, sniffed the fresh pine-scented wood walls, and then turned and looked at Thomas. Those eyes, bright, calm, and deep, were no longer the same ones that once trembled under the harsh lights of an auction block. Now, they held something different, guardianship. Because at that moment, Rook was no longer a victim. He was the gatekeeper, the symbol, the hope. And Rook's Refuge was no longer just a shelter. It was a living answer to a world that once turned away. Proof that even a soul, once thought broken, can become the starting place where others learn how to rise. That afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the roof of Rook's refuge, its soft light stretched across the pine-scented boards, still fresh with resin. Thomas sat alone on the steps. Rook lay beside him, head resting on his leg, eyes no longer hollow like in the beginning, but still carrying something unspoken in their quiet depth. The breeze carried the scent of pine mixed with old ash, and suddenly, in a moment that cracked time open, a picture returned that Thomas had tried for years to forget. It wasn't a dream. It was a memory. Back then, Thomas was young and had never imagined how far he'd drift from his conscience. He was a hired handyman, working at one of the satellite facilities tied to Wilcox Ranch. Not the main one, but still a place where difficult dogs were kept. Those that didn't respond to training were sent there for reconditioning. At the time, he thought simply, take the pay, fix the pens, weld the cages, and leave before dark. That night, as the wind picked up, Thomas was repairing the back kennel door when he heard a faint crackling from the old storage shed. A wire had shorted. Then fire caught the straw blankets. In minutes, flames rose. Thomas shouted for help, but the compound was empty that night. Black smoke curled from the roof. The smell of burning plastic scraped at his throat. At that moment, he nearly ran, but just then, from Kennel 3, a dog burst out. No barking, no growl, just ran straight for him. A German shepherd, not large. One side of his coat singed, a slight drag in the hind leg, amber eyes filled with fire and wariness, but he lunged through the smoke and clamped onto Thomas's sleeve, pulling hard. Not to attack, to lead. Thomas was yanked from the fire just as the roof collapsed. They both tumbled into the muddy earth, gasping for breath. The dog lay beside him, eyes locked on his as if asking, "What are you waiting for? Go." And Thomas did. He ran. He didn't look back, didn't open Kennel 3, told himself there was nothing more he could do, that he was just the hired help. But from that day forward, he never slept in peace. Now, with Rook lying beside him, the light fading on the grass, Thomas knew. It was him. It had always been him. The same eyes, the same limp, the silent reflex around the fire. It wasn't a coincidence. Rook had met him once before, in a moment of smoke and instinct. Back then, Rook saved him, and in return, Thomas had turned away, left him behind. The wind blew cold, like time brushing against his sleeve, whispering something old. Thomas bowed his head and placed a hand on Rook's back, where healed scars still refused to grow fur. He whispered, "I ran that day, and I've lived 10 years under the shadow of that silence. But I'm here now. I won't run again." Rook didn't turn to look at him, but his tail gave a small thump, just once, as if to say he understood, that the memory had never left, and that forgiveness doesn't always need words, only someone willing to stay. The morning after the reflection, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the pines on the eastern side of Rook's refuge, Thomas stood on the porch, a cup of cold coffee in hand, eyes fixed on the deep woods. Rook sat below the wooden steps, calm as always, but his ears were perked up. He wasn't looking at the cabin, but farther, toward something Thomas couldn't see, but Rook somehow already knew. It wasn't the first time Rook had done that. He often sensed things beyond what the eye could see. But this morning, Thomas felt something different in the stillness around him. A tightening, a quiet buildup like the breath before a storm. And he knew something was waiting. A door not yet closed, and only Rook knew the way. Just hours later, a call from Deputy Dwyer interrupted his late breakfast. The deputy's voice was low, urgent, and left no room for hesitation. "Thomas, we've got a new lead, an old camp on the northern edge of Custer Forest, been listed as abandoned for 6 years. But this morning, a ranger reported chimney smoke and an old truck pulling out at dawn." Thomas didn't need more detail. He nodded, though Dwyer couldn't see it. "Meet me at turnoff 7, Dwyer said. "Bring him. I think Rook will know where to go." As the pickup truck turned onto the overgrown path to the north, the trees grew thicker, and light spilled through the canopy like fragments of old memories unfolding. Rook sat in the passenger seat, body tense but steady, his eyes scanning both sides of the road. At the final bend, he suddenly perked up, pressed his nose to the window, and let out a low sound. Not a growl, but a signal. Thomas stopped. They were there. Dwyer was already waiting in an unmarked SUV parked at the forest's edge. No SWAT team, no canine unit, just a handgun at his side and a worn, creased map in hand. When Rook stepped out of the truck, Dwyer stared at him for a long moment before turning to Thomas. "Let him lead. We go in on foot." The camp was hidden behind 3 rows of old pines, its tin roof rusted but still intact. The air carried a quiet, chilling mix of burnt wood, disinfectant, and dried grass. Rook didn't rush. Each step was slow and deliberate, his nose grazing the ground like he was rereading a story someone had tried to erase with fire. As the trio neared the rusted fence, a sound echoed from inside. Chains clinking. Rook froze, ears straight, body tight like a drawn bowstring. Thomas stopped, hand instinctively resting on his flashlight. Dwyer signaled for silence, drew his gun, and stepped forward. Then a kennel door slammed open, not by a hand, but from a violent yank from the inside. A gaunt man in a torn fur coat, hair matted like forest vines, burst out. In his hand, a leather whip, his eyes cold, dry, and cunning. But the moment he saw Rook, he froze. "No, it can't be." Thomas stepped out from the shadow of the trees. "Hello, Roar." Everett Roar let out a guttural cry, not from his mouth, but in the wild panic that flared in his eyes. He turned and ran. But Rook moved. No command, no shout, just instinct. He shot through the brush, intercepting him near an old kennel, not attacking, just blocking his path. Roar stumbled to the ground. Rook stood above him, growling low, not in threat, but as if to say, "Enough!" Dwyer lunged, pinned him down, and cuffed his wrists. As Thomas approached and looked into the face that had haunted him for decades, he didn't feel rage, only silence, as if justice had already spoken, for him, in a language that needed no blood. Rook walked back to Thomas, panting, his paws muddy, back damp with dew, but his eyes, clearer than anyone else's in the forest that morning. Thomas knelt and placed a hand over Rook's chest. "We did it, didn't we?" The tail gave a small wag, not fast, not proud, just enough to answer. An ending to a quiet journey. And also a beginning for the other souls still waiting for someone to reach out. The moment Everett Roar was cuffed and led away from the abandoned camp, silence ceased to be a shadow hiding in the woods. It became a witness. And this time, the truth had nowhere left to hide. Thomas returned to the cabin with red, swollen hands and hollowed eyes. Rook lay still by the fireplace, needing no praise, no comfort. But in the way he looked at Thomas as the door closed behind him, something had shifted. No longer guarded trust, but unconditional presence. The day of the hearing arrived colder than usual. Snow fell lightly on the roof of the Gallatin County Courthouse, tinting the sky pale like a chalk drawing left unfinished. Inside the wood-paneled chamber, the public seating was packed with people from Billings, Laurel, and even Livingston, towns where the story of Rook and Rook's refuge had reached hearts. Thomas wore a white shirt and neatly tied black tie, standing at the center of the courtroom. Across from him, Roar sat handcuffed, a bruise on his cheek from the scuffle during his escape. His expression held traces of mockery, but his eyes no longer burned with pride. Now they were stripped bare. Only exhaustion remained. The first witness was Marcus, a former employee of Wilcox Ranch. Short silver hair and a weathered build, he stepped up to the stand with a voice rough from cigarettes and years of unsaid guilt. "I got fired for refusing to hit a dog," he said. "I saw them use electric prods, starve them, force them to fight. They called it training. Truth is, It was torture. Next came Alina, the vet who treated Rook. She presented the microchip scan directly linking Rook to Wilcox Ranch, listing Everett Roar as the last registered owner. Images of Rook's circular burn marks were displayed large on the screen, each scar, each wound impossible to erase. The courtroom fell silent. Rook wasn't in the courtroom. But outside, Thomas walked him slowly through the gathered crowd on a cloth leash. Some recognized him, some cried, and some, who once looked away from limping animals, now met his calm gaze and realized they had been silent for too long. When Thomas took the stand, he didn't look at Roar. He looked straight at the jury. I worked for him. I walked past kennels filled with howls and pretended I didn't hear them. But then a dog saved me. Not once, but twice. And the second time, he showed me. It's never too late to do what's right. He paused, then raised a photograph, printed from the auction video. Rook, skinny, standing on the dusty floor, and Thomas's hand, raised silently among the crowd. This wasn't just a rescue, it was an apology, and this time I didn't turn away. Finally, the prosecutor presented the closing evidence, a previously unreleased video pulled from a memory card found in an old kennel during the raid. It showed Rook, younger than, but already with those unnervingly calm eyes. He was dragged from a cage and hit repeatedly with an electric prod. No sound. None needed. Just watching was enough. He didn't bite, didn't howl, only held his gaze steady at the man hurting him, and stayed standing to the very end. After 3 days of testimony, the verdict came down. Everett Roar, sentenced to prison without parole for orchestrated animal cruelty, evidence tampering, and federal violations regarding live animal confinement. Thomas stepped out of the courthouse, shoulders heavy, but eyes clear. Rook waited at the steps, rising when he saw him, not jumping, not barking, just walking over and pressing gently against his knee, the way he always did to say, "I'm still here." And on that March afternoon, as the snow began to melt on the courthouse windows, the story of Rook, the one once cast aside like a wrinkle no one wanted to face, had become the wind that made an entire town keep its eyes open again. Weeks after the verdict was delivered, the town slowly returned to its usual rhythm. But in the hearts of those who had witnessed the story of Rook and Thomas, something had shifted, as if compassion once stirred could no longer be put back to sleep, and in the hush that followed the storm, something beautiful was beginning to take shape. On the first morning, Rook's Refuge officially opened its doors. The ground was still veiled in a thin mist, each blade of grass holding drops of dew like tears left over from a long dream. On the land that had once been just a pencil sketch, now stood solid wooden kennels, a clean recovery ward, and a wide lawn spacious enough for a dog to run free without barriers. Thomas stood at the gate, quietly watching a small line of trucks delivering the first dogs, not lively, affectionate animals ready for love, but shadows curled in on themselves, eyes cautious, each step heavy with fear, as if the earth beneath them might betray them at any moment. Some wore rusted old chains. Some bore the marks of cages still pressed into the fur on their necks. Alina and the team of volunteers divided the intake work among themselves. No one rushed to pet them. No one called names or offered comfort out of reflex. They simply opened the kennels, sat down on the ground, and waited. Because they had learned from Rook that healing doesn't start with a command. It starts with presence, patience, and quiet. In the middle of the lawn, where the morning sun was beginning to clear the last of the cold mist, Rook stood motionless. He didn't stretch or bark. He just stood there, back straight, eyes fixed on the new arrivals emerging from the dark. Like a sentinel. Like a soul that had walked through hell and now returned to lead others out. From kennel number 2, a small gray dog, thin as a dried twig, stepped out hesitantly. He trembled, his back leg slightly limping. Rook didn't move, but his gaze, gentle, deeper than any voice, followed the little dog's every motion, unwavering. When the pup stopped in the middle of the field and turned back toward the kennel as if to retreat, Rook took a single step forward. Not close, not imposing, just enough to create a path. The little dog stood still and sniffed the air. One step, then another, until he came to stand beside Rook, not touching but close enough that their breaths mingled in the thin morning mist. Rook looked ahead, not sideways, but his tail gave a slight wag, just once, as he had done for Thomas, and that was enough. Across the grounds, wary eyes slowly shifted to curiosity, then to cautious interest. Rook didn't guide with barks. He guided with presence, steady, grounded, asking nothing but time and trust. Thomas watched from a distance, hand resting on the fence post, his heart easing like a wooden plank finally drying out after a long, wet season. He didn't walk over, didn't call Rook's name, because he knew Rook didn't need praise. He just needed a place to do what was right and to be himself. The center bore his name not to glorify, but to remember that in this world there are beings who were once discarded, forced into roles they were never born to play, yet somehow still chose to rise and become the light for those who have never known it. That afternoon, sunlight poured over Rook's refuge in April's gentlest hue. On the freshly misted grass, the newly rescued dogs were slowly learning to step out of the darkness, not with rushed strides, but with slow exploration, eyes waiting for a sign that this place wasn't like the others. The wind drifted in from the forest, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp soil. It nudged open the wooden porch door where Thomas sat. In front of him lay an old leather-bound journal, its spine worn by years, the pages yellowed but smooth, each line of ink like the heartbeat of someone who had lived long in silence. Rook lay at his feet, body stretched out, his head resting lightly on Thomas's dust-covered boot. He is no longer startled by sudden noises, no longer tensed when shadows passed by. He wasn't fully asleep, but at ease, as if he had finally found a place quiet enough to breathe deeply, real enough to dream long. Thomas looked out across the yard, where the golden light of late day cast crisscrossing patterns of shadow and sun. The wounded dogs, both in body and spirit, were slowly finding their new rhythm. One curled beside a tree, another paced the fence as if testing whether this safety was real. A few still hugged the walls, eyes skeptical, but all of them, everyone, were somewhere without cages, without prods, without shouts. He turned back to the journal. Flipping to a blank page, he held his pen not as if writing, but as if speaking to himself. Some things take a lifetime to find the courage to face. Some souls never speak, but when they walk into your life, they force you to confront the part of yourself that's been asleep. Rook is one of those souls. He paused, eyes blurring as the memories flooded back, still vivid as if he could feel the dust-choked air of that auction again. Rook had stood there, not pleading, not afraid, but with a gaze so still, it felt like he had already seen the whole world. And Thomas, for a reason he couldn't name then, raised his hand. I thought I was saving him from being forgotten, but now I see. It was he who saved me. From my silence, from the shadow of my compromise. He is a living reminder that compassion isn't what we say. It's what we do, quietly, again and again. Thomas looked up. Rook hadn't moved, but his ears twitched as if he'd heard every word. Thomas closed the journal. There was no need to write more. The most important truths, he knew, didn't need many words. Far off, Lily, the neighbor girl who had once been the first to reach out to Rook, was helping the volunteers guide a trembling little pup into the yard. The pup looked lost, eyes wide and unsure. But when Rook rose and walked slowly over, no growl, no bark, just stopping one step away, the little dog stopped shaking. As if it were instinct, Rook didn't need to teach. He just needed to be. And in that presence, the other dogs felt something. Here, they didn't have to be brave right away. Here, they were allowed to be fragile, until they learned, in their own time, to stand. Thomas watched him, a tender, quiet emotion welling up. Maybe it was something he'd lost long ago. Belief in redemption, in second chances, in the power of a gaze that held no judgment. The sun dipped behind the pines. Light stretched long across the ground, washing away the afternoon chill. On the wooden porch, Thomas patted the space beside him. Rook walked over, unhurried, sat, and rested his head on Thomas's knee as he always did. No one looked back. They had learned to move forward, not to forget, but to live, for those who still couldn't, for souls still waiting for a hand to reach out. And there, in a quiet forest clearing in Montana, beside a rescue center named after a dog, life had begun again, quietly, but no less powerfully. Because sometimes what saves us isn't a miracle. It's a small creature that places all its faith in what we no longer believe in ourselves. And in the end, the question, who saved who, no longer matters, because the answer had long lived in the steady, peaceful gaze of Rook. You've just traveled with us through a story, not just about a forgotten dog, but about redemption, forgiveness, and a wordless friendship between two souls once broken. From the moment Thomas raised his hand at a cold auction to the day Rook stood watch on a sunlit lawn, guiding others who were learning to trust again, this is not just their story. It's ours. If you've ever turned away from pain and are now learning to act instead, this story is for you. So what about you? Have you ever met a dog or a person who unexpectedly changed your life? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear it. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who cares, and subscribe to the channel so we can spread more quiet kindness, like the peace in Rook's eyes. Thank you for staying until the very end.